right, you folks ready to start? I mostly wanted to start 1 minute early because I'm never early for anything, and so this is my chance. And I don't know if I apologize or I am bragging about these slides. I stole the deck from something, and maybe it was TechEd or something, and I love it because there's so many ways to interpret it. Like, in one way, the cloud is like sending all this data and powering everything, but in another way, it's like this evil thing that it's like taking their stuff and it's like attacking their city and everything. So that's me. I'm John Galloway. I'm a technical evangelist, and you can reach me on the Twitters and on email, or here, of course, which is really cool. So I'm going to be talking about front-end web dev, and I'm going to set the stage with just some kind of mostly obvious things, but we'll talk about why we're talking about front-end web dev and stuff. So traditional web dev, if you think file new MVC and you create a model and you scaffold it out and you click back and forth. You've got, you make your request to the server, you get back everything, right? HTML and CSS and JavaScript and everything. And then you click on a link and it all happens all over again, right? This is a traditional workflow. So front-end web dev, of course, you make the first request and you get everything down the first time. And in fact, this is actually going to be a lot bigger, right? There's cases where it's multiple megabytes, right? So it can take a while to load. But then, following a request, you're just getting data back. So that's the selling point, right? That's why you would do it. So let's talk about why we're building single-page applications. And user experience is important. Resume building, probably not as important, keeping up with other web devs, and definitely not because they're easier. They're a pain in the neck, really, to get set up. So it really is pretty easy to do simple request response to a server, right? And when you're managing front end and back end, there's a lot of other stuff to think about. So you have more concepts to keep in mind. You have more that you have to think about. There's definitely new frameworks all the time. There's you're working with multiple languages, right? So not only just C# and HTML and a little JavaScript, it's a lot of JavaScript, and it's also probably some TypeScript and some who knows what else, less and Sass, and again, we're back to new language of the day, right? You got to worry about managing state. Where is your state? Is it on the client or the server or both, and how you keep them in sync? You have to worry about resources, and you also have to worry about your resource pipeline. Now, when I first started reading about all these resource pipeline things and ways of handling your build and all this, I kind of thought it was overkill. And in some ways, I do think that the JavaScript community has done a good job of overcomplicating things. It still drives me nuts when I do, npm install and I see C++ builds running, and I'm like, wow, how did we do this, right? How did we go from on-click to I have to configure Python and C++ to do anything? But there are some important things that the resource pipelines are doing for us, right? They're transpiling things, they're compacting them, they're in some cases really optimizing them. They can be running builds. So there's a lot going on in terms of making your back-end build work and your front-end build work. So I'll run just the super quick run through on some of the different types of single-page app frameworks. So of course you've got Angular. Who here has done a good amount with Angular? Okay, and which of you, I'm assuming a lot of you started with Angular 1 dot something and have moved up and looking at or using Angular 2. So there's of course all this drama about Angular 2. I honestly like it a lot by comparison. So I did some stuff with Angular 1, and every time I thought I learned something, then people would be like, oh, you really don't want to do that. You want to inject a service using a resource, and you need this, and I'm like, okay, back to the drawing board. And it seemed like I was never, I don't know, it seemed like there was a lot going on there. I really feel like a lot of the frameworks are learning from each other at this point. Angular 2 definitely seems simpler. I'm seeing some nodding heads from people who look smart and have beards, so that's good. But just the general idea of components, you're seeing this kind of standardized across frameworks, right? So instead of having to do all this stuff with services that are injecting things and directives and blah, 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 you're really just layering components on top of each other. I'll show you an example of something that we did for build this past year, and I wanted to do something that was not just hello world, but a little bit more complicated. And we did a master details grid, and you edit one, it updates the other, and all that. And it really like seemed to all kind of like the difficulty did not increase as we went along. So that was nice. So that's Angular 2. Another one, Knockout. So Knockout is just a binding, like it's front-end binding. It's declarative binding and handles kind of dependency tracking and all that kind of stuff. Pretty simple, and that's nice if you don't want to bring in a lot of complexity and you just want to do binding. A lot of people using Knockout, so yeah. So it's one of those things where it works at what it does. They do use it on the Azure portal, so I mean it does get used a good amount. React. So I also I first looked at Angular and then I went to React. I'm like, oh man, this is way easier. And one of the things is that it does have this component kind of thing. So you're building components and just nesting those components and calling each other. But another thing that's really nice is this one-way data flow. So the way that it works is you're setting something on a component and then things happen and it pushes things down through the stack. So you're setting properties and they kind of ripple down through, and you're not worrying about one thing happening that changes something else. It kind of re-renders the whole DOM, the virtual DOM. And that freaked me out at first when I thought it was doing that, because I thought that was crazy. Like it would be really inefficient and it would take forever, but the way that it's done with the dirty tracking is very quick. So I've been pretty happy with that as well. That's pretty nice. One other thing, let me see, virtual DOM. Yep, it's gone. Oh well. Ember, is anyone using Ember anymore? It was like a big thing for a bit, and then okay. So anyhow. Okay, who here's been using ASP.NET Core like along the long winding road? Like using it a good amount? Okay, so things have changed over time in a lot of ways, right? And so part of I'm on these weekly shows about it. I'm like following along. I'm involved with it, and it's tough for me to keep up. And sometimes I think it's good to kind of step back and set kind of like, here's the different options, here's where we were and where we're going. So that's what I kind of thought we'd do with this, is look at, here's what our options are when you're doing ASP.NET Core apps, right? So how you get your stuff into your application, how you manage it, et cetera. So for a while, we were doing something that was a little bit more complicated. We were using NPM and Gulp by default, and then we said, well, if you don't like it, you can rip it out of there, but of course everyone would love it. But what we saw over time was it was more complicated than a lot of people wanted when we're already throwing a lot at them, right? A whole new runtime, a whole new cross-platform stuff. A lot of things have changed in ASP.NET, and so we thought it was, smarter people than me, thought it was good to say, hey, if you want to turn up the complexity, you can, but let's start you really easy. So we're going to work our way kind of down the list here, and I'll show you some examples and stuff. So we'll start with the file new option, which is Bundler-Minifier. So this actually kind of snuck in right when we shipped the release. And like I said before that, it was NPM and Gulp. At release, what we did was we're using this Bundler-Minifier. This is a lot of different things. It is a Visual Studio extension, but it's integrated into the Task Runner Explorer, and it's also a command line tool. So it works great in Visual Studio, but it also works on a Mac and Visual Studio Code, whatever, right? So it's command line. It can all be run from command line. It's open source, and it's also kind of got this grow up story, which I'll talk about. As far as open source, part of what's nice about that is that it's not just some new thing that was thrown together at the last minute. So you'll see here there's 326 commits. There's stuff going back for a while. It was made over a year ago, and I'm guessing if you're a web dev that's interested in ASP.NET and Visual Studio and stuff, you know Mads Christensen. He builds like all the cool web extensions. So this is something he's built. So this is out on GitHub, and so there that is. So if we go in, I think that's my last slide on it. So let's go into build an app, and we'll just look at it. So I've got file new project. Now, Jeff Fritz would make fun of me because I'm not. But to be fair, this is a new laptop, so, I used to remember how, maybe someone here knows, you can go and tweak it so that like when you do file new, it's like web application 2538 or whatever, and I forget how you do that. So maybe if somebody gets bored, they can look into that. All right, so I'm creating a new application. So let me describe what we're going to see in here and see if I can beat it. Nope, I can't. Oh well. OK, so in our project JSON, let's actually start there. We're going to see, in addition to the other things, we're going to see a tool set up here for Bundler-Minifier. Where is it? So we have some stuff in here. You'll see Bower, but you'll also see, where is it? Tools, Bundler-Minify. There's browser link. All right, well, maybe just trust me. It should be in here as a tool. Maybe I'm not. 26? There it is, Bundler-Minifier core. All right, and you have good eyes too. Let's zoom that up a bit. Right, so that's a tool that's brought in via a NuGet package. So that's important for the cross-platform and all that stuff, right? And so what happens now is I've got this bundle config JSON, and this is what configures how things are built and minified and all that kind of stuff. Right? So some of the things that gives me is I can go in, and if I add in, like, say, a JavaScript file, then I can right-click on it, and I can say, now this is a pretty small JavaScript file to begin with, but I could rebundle it if I wanted. So let's see. There's our minified code. Rather minimal. Yes. Infinite compression. So that's kind of, wow, this is pretty small. Bring this over. Okay, so, and it offers you that kind of stuff across. So like, CSS as well, you can go in. So it's already done this for me, but I can go and it'll say rebundle file, and then, you can see all that. So that's at design time, and then as well, it can be hooked up for runtime. Like I said, it integrates with the task runner. So what that means is here we've got things like we can say update all files. You see the command line output. And we can say clean output files and all that kind of stuff. I really like this console integration stuff because it shows me Visual Studio's not cheating. I always hated that, when Visual Studio's like, there's some secret handshake and who knows what they're doing. And I like to be able to look at this and I can say, I can automate this, right? I can do this on my own. So that is some of the general stuff. There's a lot more that's available in the Bundler-Minifier. And to look more in detail on that, there's a lot of stuff right here. Like, first of all, there's this kind of salesy page where it shows you the bundling minification I showed you. You can hook it up. So you say, right-click, and you say enable bundle on build. So that's kind of cool. And that's integrated, I believe, with the Task Runner Explorer thing. So we go into Bundler-Minify. It should be there. Well, maybe he's lying. All right. And so also support for source maps, et cetera. I showed you that Task Runner Explorer. That's the thing down at the bottom. So that's kind of the main thing there. And then there's other documentation. But what I wanted to show you here is this convert to gulp. And so what I can do is I can right-click on this. I'll zoom it here. So right-click, and we say Bundler-Minify, convert to gulp. So it warns you that it'll take several minutes, and then it's done, and it's done. So I don't know what's going on there. And the interesting thing you'll see here with this is when I first ran this, it freaked me out because I said, it gave me a build error on this, on the gulp file. right? So update all files, clean. There it is. So it says down here, gulp file failed to load. I'm not going to zoom in it because it's just a sad thing. It doesn't work. But what I will show you is there's actually, it does tell you how to fix it if you read closely. So over here in this gulp file it generates, it says, make sure bundle config JSON doesn't contain any comments. All right. So now let's do that. I go over to bundle config and it does contain comments. And I wonder, like, you know, Mads, you made all this output here. Maybe you could have, like, not done that. But to be fair, the comments are generally kind of nice to have, but they're not valid JSON, right? So depending on which JSON parser you're using. And there was kind of this movement over time to which JSON parser we use and stuff. So now that I've removed those, let's rebuild. Good, and now our gulp file has all our tasks. So the gulp file has all these different tasks that are defined in code that will say things like clean, minify, blah, 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 blah. And then I can double click on them and run them there. Okay. So let's step back a second because I just ran through some things. I was talking about bundling and minifying, and now I'm talking about gulp tasks, and so let's talk about what that is. That's the grow up story I wanted to get into, right? So that's, yes?
Does the bundler handle dependency management? Like, does it require common data?
So I believe it does, but I don't know how sophisticated it is. And so this is great. Cortana on my phone woke up and it's searching for crazy things. And I'm not saying this stuff, so. Okay, if you look in here, he's actually using some libraries for bundling. And I believe it's spelled out somewhere in here like which library it runs on top of. So let me look that up afterwards. Okay, so grunt and gulp. So the idea with both of these is they're these front-end task runners. So the idea being that you've got your JavaScript libraries are no more just simple like scripts that you include, right? Dependency management, that's important, that was just brought up. You have things like bundling and what can be minified and all that sort of thing. Dependencies are really difficult, right? You've got to load things in the right order. Who here has had problems where, something, when you're first using jQuery and it's like, why isn't this, oh, I've got to put my reference before it, So that's tricky. So you end up with these front-end task runners that do that for you. So bundling, minifying, transpilers, so this is, your JSX, TSX, less, Sass, CoffeeScript, whatever, TypeScript. Then copying files. Why would you want to copy files? Well, let's take a look back here and see it in action. So we've got, because I did this convert to grunt file or gulp file, now I've got this package JSON, right? So if I open this up, we'll see that it references a bunch of packages, lists all the dependencies out. Let's expand out and show our show all hidden files. And now we've got, here's our node modules. Okay, so this is a lot of stuff, right? And I forget now why I was talking about that. Copy files, right? Okay, so if this was all in my web root, this is a ton of files. And if you go through and you actually look at some of these files, like I don't even know which one we want to look at here, but do we have left pad? Oh. Okay, let's look at a pretty sane one actually, Lodash, right? But that has this distribution, but it also has a license, it has a README doc. Some of these have like huge, like they have performance test suites in them, they have sample code, right? So you normally don't want to just dump all this stuff in your root. It's not really like a security concern or anything, but it's just a bunch of junk out on your server, right? So because of that, you end up wanting to copy your files. So you end up with a copy task that'll say, grab all this stuff from here and copy it to there. So it could be Bower, it could be NPM modules, et cetera, and copy them into your www root. And that is an important thing to point out, by the way, as I'm mentioning it. So it used to be in ASP.NET that your root, that your entire application was kind of your web root, right? So if you wanted to throw some JavaScript in, just throw it in there, right? And we'll serve it up. So now we have this concept of a web root. So it's www root. And if you have any images, JavaScript, CSS, et cetera, that you want your web server to be able to serve up, it has to go in here. Any of this stuff out here we're going to assume is your source files. It's going to be compiled, et cetera. And so you throw JavaScript or HTML out here, your web server can't find it. All right? So we need to copy stuff over. And you'll notice here we've got like this lib, and we've got files copied into lib. And that's all happening because our gulp file is doing all this stuff. So let's compare across between them. We've got both Grunt and Gulp. Both are supported by Visual Studio. Grunt was kind of, I think it came first. It's definitely the one I heard about first. And it works fine. It's automated, you can have plugins, you automate all your tasks, et cetera. It's not crazy efficient though. Okay, it's very inefficient because it uses a bunch of temp files, right? So it's actually copying files all over the place. So Gulp came along after that, and Gulp was very popular because it does a streaming build where it actually is just piping one thing to another. So that's nice for a few reasons. One, it's a lot faster and more efficient, but it's also, I think, a good amount easier to read. This kind of like fluent thing, it's usually a little bit like you're not reading a configuration file, you're reading code that's a little bit easier to kind of see what's going on. So that's Gulp. So I've been showing you some of that, but basically like you go in, when you view them, it understands and parses it and shows it in Task Runner. If you've got the right extensions installed, you'll actually see Gulp and Grunt, which is fun, right? Okay, so what we've got here is you can double click on any of these and run them. Like I showed you, you'll see that there. You can also bind stuff. So that's really useful. You can say like, when I do a Visual Studio build, then I want this or that to happen. So the way you hook any of that up, you can just go in, here's your bindings. So you can go in and you can see what's there, and you can say like, I would like to run, clean before a build. And I'd like to run min CSS after build. And I've probably destroyed the project already, but that's the kind of like, right? So now every time I build, then it's going to do all that stuff just automatically. So that's neat. One important thing to point out with this is sometimes we show all the same things together at the same time, and it gives the wrong impression. So you can use all these Visual Studio tools with whatever, including web forms, MVC5, whatever, right? So here's an example. I just took a web forms application and I added in a Gulp file and started pulling things in with NPM and Bower, et cetera, right? So I just want to make sure it's clear that they're not like, they all kind of came around at the same time, and you're likely going to want to use the newer things with the newer things, but you can mix and match, right? So you don't have to use NPM, Gulp, whatever. You can, if you want to, in an ASP.NET Core application, you're welcome to put in script tags and just go from there, right? Or if you want to, in a 10-year-old web forms app, you can, well, I don't know, one that you can open in Visual Studio 2015, you can start using Gulp and Grunt. All right, one other one I'm going to point out in a bit is Webpack. And so Webpack is, like I said, there's a new one, there's a new framework or a new thing every 2 weeks, right? So Webpack is newer than Gulp, so it's better, of course. But some of the things that are nice with it is it can be more efficient, so it can split things out. And I'm sure you've seen over time where people will show here's the download size of this website, and here's how it's gone to, from 400K to 16 megabytes or whatever, it's crazy. Like some websites, there was one website recently somebody showed that was larger than the original Doom application, like to run Doom, right? So it ends up getting insane, right? And so one thing that Webpack can do for you is you can have, in development, you can set it up to load everything, don't worry about it. When you're in production, it can really optimize things out. So it can split your dependencies out and just give you what you need and improve your initial load time. So that's kind of the general idea with that. All right, and then Bower. Bower is another thing. So Bower, you'll see, is in here, and we're using it. We've got this Bower JSON. So Bower is a very simple way to get things into your app, and I believe I can just do, like, if I do something like D3, right? You'll see we've got autocomplete in here for that. So then it's going to go and pull 421 is the latest. Then you'll see my dependencies are restoring, right? So now I've got D3 in the app, right? So Bower started to get a lot of attention earlier, but then things got confused because Angular 2 said, we're not going to use Bower, right? We're just going to use NPM. And so it's kind of a bit of limbo. And that's actually a good reason why Visual Studio and the ASP.NET team try not to pick sides too much, right? Because you really don't know where things are going. And even if there's a really popular one, well, somebody else might say, hey, I really like Aurelia, right? Or whatever, right? So we want to support some of the larger, more popular things, listen to user feedback, but not force you down a specific road. All right, any questions so far? Making sense? Great, because we're going to take a crazy turn in a second. Oh, well, first, before I do that, the web extension pack. So who here is using the web extension pack? Yeah, okay, so if you're using Visual Studio to do web dev, you should probably, and you don't have the web extension pack and you do have a laptop, you should ignore everything else I'm saying. You should go out and you should get this web extension pack. So it's the nice thing with this web extension pack is it brings all its friends with it. So it's one web extension pack install, and then it goes and it gets all these other good ones. So let me show you here. If we go, there it is. But they're not like a bunch of random crappy ones. You'll be happy, right? So some things like, for instance, glyph friend is nice. So it can actually autocomplete and show you glyphs for obvious things. It has file nesting is nice. So it makes it easier to nest files. So if you're minifying different things. Add new file is great if you want to add a file that has like dot getignore, whatever, .bower config or whatever it is. You can add those without Visual Studio freaking out. Image sprites is great. JavaScript snippet pack is really nice. Markdown editor. This is, and another one that's neat is the suggested extensions. So what it'll do for that is if you open, say, a Markdown file or Bower config or whatever, it'll say like, hey, I noticed you opened this file. There's an extension that works just with that. Would you like that one? Right? So I do recommend that. All right, so we're going to look at an example of doing it kind of the hard way, I think, and then we'll look at using other tools to kind of get us out of that mess. So let's go to, here's one. Did anyone here go to build? Yeah. Did you happen to go to the web code lab thing? Nope. Okay. All right. So at Build, we had this thing this year where we had this live code lab thing, and we had presenters at the front, and they would say, "Okay, great. Open Visual Studio. Click here and do this," and they would kind of talk through what we were doing and how to do it. So I mentioned earlier that as part of that, I wanted to do something that was like not just a made-up file in a project thing. So we did this, let me see. we've got this lab, and I wanted to show it off, but it's actually not completely, it's like 99% of the way updated for RTM, but it's not yet. So, but this is a long, complex lab. And here we go through and we show you things about like how to hook up. Now this is just for Angular 2, right? But we've got System X and we've got to configure the package loading and dependencies for that. And then as part of that also, okay, so that's the application itself. We also have a custom gulp task, right? So the way we handled this gulp task is we created a, we've got all the dependencies are in node modules. We're using a custom grid component. So again, I mentioned before, I like that about Angular 2 is that it's really component based, and I kind of wanted to test that and see how well it worked. So I found this one that was open source, and it's a pretty complex, fully featured grid control. And so I said, okay, can it work? And I contacted the owner of this, and he said, yeah, great, go for it. And we're just releasing this new thing, and blah, blah, blah. So that's what I used, this AG grid, right? So then that brought on a ton of other dependencies, right? So now I need to migrate all those around. So what I did for that is we created this custom, we created some more gulp tasks that did this thing called move to libs, and it went and it found our specific, all these other AG grid was our thing, so we needed all our styles and all the libraries for that. It's got its own system for those. And so then we called this other task called move single file, and it would copy them all over. So that is what we kind of spelled out in here. The way we did it all is like this lab actually is if you search for, I'm scrolling the wrong way. Okay. So if you want to search for, it's this build 2016 code labs, and so that has this kind of walkthrough on that. And again, the ASP.NET code not completely up to date. Hopefully, will be soon. But the way we handled the dependencies and stuff, that is up to date. So that all works. And if we go and we look at the gulp file, we look at the task runner. So we've got all our tasks as far as, when it started up, it did all this copy dependencies. So that was set up as a binding. So we've got project open, move to libs ran. You see that? So that move to libs was that task where it just went through and copied all the dependencies over. So that works. And you're started then to just begin starting your application. So this, honestly, this took us a little while to get set up, right? And also things like that, how you're hooking in System.js. That was like, or System X, I guess. But, just managing your dependencies there, because every framework seems to have its own kind of way of doing things and managing dependencies and stuff. So this is a meta loader that runs on top of other loaders, et cetera. Crazy. So, it's great. It's awesome. It's super great. So, but if you don't want to do that all by hand, then I would recommend you start with Yeoman. So there's two different kind of generators that I'll show you for that. And the first one we've been working in the community with for a while is this one. It's out on the Omni Sharp repository. So Omni Sharp is the kind of backend that powers IntelliSense for VS Code, but also a lot of other things, Atom and Vim and whatever, like tons of different front ends. So a lot of people know, or a lot of people have heard about it as a that it exists, but a lot of people don't know that it also has all these single file scaffolders, right? So it'll scaffold a whole project for you, but also it can go in and it can say like, just give me a Docker file, right? Or just scaffold out, user secrets or whatever. So that's kind of nice too. So how that looks in action, let's do, all right. So, no. Okay, great. So here I can do, I'll type yo, and this brings up Yeoman. And so then it says, what do you want to run, right? So I'm going to run the ASP.NET Scaffolder. The way I got that was I just installed via npm. So I said npm install -g generator ASP.NET. If you don't remember that, you can go and you can find it on here. So that's listed right here on this, and it shows how to install it, right? So getting started, and it'll walk you through all this. So those are your dependencies, that's how to do it, and then how to run it, right? So, and in order to search for this, you can search for generator ASP.NET. There's also links to this from docs.asp.net. So if you go, docs.asp.net is our main documentation, and I believe building projects with Yeoman. So it'll walk you through there as well. So docs.asp.net, we've been putting a ton of work into this, keeping it up to date and adding in things. And keeping it up to date, as you know, is a lot of work because there's been a lot of changes to it. So there really is a lot of, there's a lot of good stuff in here. So this also will walk you through Yeoman. Okay, so back to this. So I said I want to create something using Yeoman for ASP.NET, and it's saying, okay, great, what kind of application? Right. So I can go through and I can pick my application type. I'm going to do web app basic without membership and auth. Here's a neat thing that is available in Yeoman that you don't see in Visual Studio is it says what UI framework. So Bootstrap is the default, but you also can use Semantic UI. Semantic UI, as you'd guess, is kind of geared more towards semantic HTML, right? So usually, like Bootstrap is a little bit slower learning curve. You don't. It's a lot easier to kind of plug things in. I prefer Semantic UI just kind of as a like it uses the HTML semantics to kind of drive the structure. So that's kind of nice. But I'm going to use that. Okay, there we go. So that's pretty fast, right? It just spit all the files out. So you can think of that as basically that was file new project, you know, for a command line. So now I can cd into it. Okay, so there's my app, and then I can do .NET build, first restore. Here, let's switch to using this. Okay, good. So .NET restore. And then from here on out, it's kind of standard. I could open it up in Visual Studio. I can also open it up in I can open in VS Code. I'm not sure what's going on. This is usually very quick. But really, there's no more, like that's kind of basically it. The one other thing I would show is that I can also then, once I've got my app there, is I can go in and start running these custom generators to do things like there we go. Right, so I could run something like, you know, or I would like a new web API controller. So I can go and type that in, right? So let's see if it's done. No, it's still doing it. That was weird. I hit Control C and it worked. So.
I think his text was selected, so it was.
Oh. I don't know though, because I just hit .NET Restore. There it is. All right. So I could, like in here, I can say CD controllers, and then what I'm going to paste in is this. right? So that's yo ASP.NET Web API controller values controller. So it adds that in. So I guess I need to install that one, which I would do, but I don't really care because I'm done with this. So,
I got a quick question.
yeah.
Do you have to run that command from the controllers folder, or will it find it for you?
For that one, yeah, I believe it just puts it where it's at. Yeah, so it's up to you. And which is interesting, by the way. So the question is, does it just run that command in the folder you're in? So there's different ways of organizing projects, and the kind of default common one is to put controllers in the controllers folder, et cetera. But there's some other ways of doing it where you do folder by feature. And so you'll say, like, this folder is for orders, and that one folder has the controllers, views, models, et cetera. So that can work, depending on your project type, that can keep things organized as well. So, yeah. Okay, so we looked at the kind of Yeoman, so that's just basically it'll spit out code. I did show that it'll build I guess I should run it, huh, or you won't believe me. So if I say, right, so that is, so this is actually important here. It says, right, because of that tool, it said bundled and minified, right? So I never opened this in Visual Studio, and that Bundler-Minify command line stuff kicked in, right? So now this is running on port 5000. So let's go over there.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So Yeoman, if I'm seeing correctly, it's use cases where like you're not using Visual Studio for whatever reason, like you're in, Linux or OS 10.
There's two reasons for it. One is if you're not using Visual Studio, or even if you've got it available, sometimes it's quicker to just not go in. But the other thing is if you're doing something if you want to do something that's not in File New Project in Visual Studio. So there's already some things that are, like for instance, Semantic UI, right? That's not in Visual Studio. And one of the things I like with this actually is that they can iterate really quick, and they can add in some other things that might not apply to every Visual Studio user, but if you're willing to install Yeoman generators, you might be interested in.
So not to ask you to tell secrets or anything, but you foresee potentially the project templates going away in Visual Studio and just going to this?
I don't see that happening. They're still figuring things out, but there's a lot. They definitely don't want to throw people off that are used to Visual Studio File New. I've even been thinking about like how hard would it be to have a file, like basically an extension that does File New Yeoman, right? And
Just call Yeoman under the hood and you get
exactly, and it could just go in and list all the ones that are out there. So actually I showed, I just shut it down. So it's not that exciting. Localhost 5000. Right, so this is just the app that I just scaffolded up, right? And I'm not sure why it's looking like that. That's odd. Maybe I'm zoomed in a lot? I don't know. Let's just move on. I don't know what I did there. That's awesome. Okay, so it might be because I have something else running. A question or just okay. All right, so there's that. So that is the kind of simple Yeoman, which is fine. But I want to show one other really cool one off, which kind of goes along the way of like, now that we can do Yeoman, what else can we do? So this is JavaScript Services. Steve Sanderson on the ASP.NET team has been building this for a while. And he's the guy that built Knockout.js. He's done a lot of really cool stuff. I like that he kind of does this really complex things to make things easy. So from a user point of view, it's really smooth and easy. And you look under the hood and you're like, whoa. So there's some neat stuff going on in here. So the idea with JavaScript Services is it's a lot of stuff. And it's a bundle of things that solves the problem of making front-end single-page applications easy, right? So it incorporates things like it's got Yeoman generators that will scaffold out an application for you that an Angular, React Redux, He's got a knockout one. I think they're looking at Aurelia as well. So that is great on its own. Another thing is that there's some stuff under the hood. So it hosts Webpack for you. So Webpack does this really cool stuff. I forgot to show, by the way. Like I mentioned the things about it doing cool dependency management. And this actually, I went in here and I did this thing where I from the command line in my application, I type, here I'll do it, so I'll go to, let's go to the Redux one. Okay. And then now here's my app, and I'll just type webpack --JSON, and I'll pipe it to stats.json. So it runs for a second, it gives me a file, right? And the first one I ran was like 600K, like it was relatively big, right? So it's actually running up TypeScript in order to compile stuff. Okay, so I took that file. This takes 15, 20 seconds. It's not really that long. There it is, okay? So I took that file and I went to webpack/analyze, and it gives you, it says, oh, all right, let's do it. So if we go to SPA, which one did I do? Redux? All right. Check this out. So now we go to stats.json. Whoa. All right, so there it is, right? So these are all the modules that are involved. And you can go in and visualize. You can see that there's only one chunk, but there are, if we look at the modules, like that's the module tree, right? So there's a lot going on. And again, this goes back to the thing of like, it's pretty easy to put script tags on. And then once you start adding a little bit more, like the depth and complexity gets really deep, right? And so here's another thing where this is a Webpack visualizer for Angular 2. And again, I took stats.json and just threw it on, right? So Webpack's doing, like Webpack can do quite a bit for you, but configuring it correctly is not super easy. And configuring it so that you've got your JavaScript or your developer stuff working well with debugging and all the cool things like hot module reloading, that working well on developer, but then in production, shipping minimal code, right? So, so he's got some things going on to do that. And if you look under the hood, the way he's actually doing that is he's using a virtual file system. And the reason he's doing that is because, okay, so I've got an application. Actually, let me start scaffolding something up, and then I'll explain it while it's doing it, right? So if I go, so let's do yo ASP.NET core-spa, and okay. So here it says, what do you want to use? Angular, Knockout, React. Any votes?
React.
All right, React. There we go. Okay, and we'll call this code on the beach. Okay, so it's building out our application. So this is similar to what we saw from the Yeoman one before, but it's doing a good amount more. So you'll see here it's restoring all these NPM packages because React pulls, brings a party with it. So we got to wait for all that to come in, right? You'll also see, depending how good your eyes are, but it's got a TS config. It's got all these .d.ts for typings, right? So it's got all this configuration for TypeScript as well. You'll see a Docker file near the top, so that's pretty neat. All the Yeoman templates bring over Docker files, and they just work. Yeah?
Speaking of TypeScript, is the TypeScript configuration still overriding the CS project, or is it everything that the TS config for
So in this, this is not using CS Proj at all, right? This is all just TS config.
Right.
Honestly, I'm not sure which in Visual Studio. So there's all our packages, and really this is not like overcomplicating things. This is kind of what's required in order to do it, right? So there's that. And I might, since I've got 10 minutes left, I'm not sure if I want to show this all right now or if I want to skip out. Yeah, I'm going to skip out of this because I see, yes, okay. Okay, so let's go into, because I scaffolded everything into the root, which was actually kind of, not, that's, I have other apps there. Oh, that was dumb. Okay, so let's go to my Angular app. Good. So this is one that I scaffolded recently, and it's got Angular in there. So now if I do this one, he's got set up to use, to set up Dotnet Watch. So what Dotnet Watch does is it actually watches if I make any change to any of the file code, it will recompile stuff, right? So I'll say .NET. So first I'll launch it, code dot. So when I call code dot, that says execute VS Code and open the current folder, right? So here's something we're going to be looking at in a second, and then I'll say .NET Watch run. All right, and so that is running, so that's on port 5000. And you'll see, actually, it's kind of interesting, you'll see stuff kind of float by down here of what's happening. So we'll look at that in a second. So I'm gonna, I think I don't have Chrome open. All right, I'm gonna get this on 5000. Great. So now let's look over here. And again, this is all this stuff that's happening on the back end. So because I'm running in development, he's writing out a lot of stuff that's showing me what's happening with Webpack, et cetera. And you'll see one thing that's exciting is it has here a request to Webpack HMR. HMR stands for Hot Module Reload. And that lets you do really cool stuff like this. I can go into my app. So first of all, I've got this is just the file new project scaffolded app. So it looks the same in Angular and React and Redux and Knockout, like it's the same app but for all of them, right? So I've got a home page, I've got a fetch data, and this calls back into a controller, right? So if I look here, there's a controllers, sample data controller. So this is returning weather data, and then on the front end, it's binding to that. So this is really, I've talked to several people lately, and they've said, hey, I want to start building something using Angular 2 and ASP.NET Core. What should I do? And this is by far the easiest way to do it because ASP.NET Core SPA, Angular 2, and then you've got an ASP.NET Core. You've got an API controller on the back end. You've got Angular. You've got on the front end a component hooked up to read from it, right? So here's our fetch data, and you'll see here's the fetch data, like where it's binding to the data, and this is the TypeScript for the actual component, right? So that is a very quick way, and it's also a way not to spend, however X number of hours like going, why isn't it loading stuff? Because I thought it would, that kind of thing. All right, so one other thing that's kind of fun is this counter. So here we look at it, this is a counter, and if I click on the button, it increments, right? Rocket science. So let's look at how that's working. If I go to my counter, like that's all there is to that one. So that's kind of nice. It is binding, and then button click binds to increment counter. And then if I look at counter, here's what increment counter does, right? So that's really pretty simple. And again, like what I was saying, I like how Angular 2 is shaped up. Like this is pretty simple in order to, once you've got things configured, like that's what's required to get a component working, which is pretty sweet. All right, so let's say that after some time, my boss says we want to increase productivity and we want to use a triple counter. Right, so that is going to count by threes. All right, so now I go over here and instead of counter plus plus, I'll say counter plus equals 1, oops, 3. Okay. So I've made that change. Now let's take a look over here. And we'll see, well, it's already flown by, but it said, hey, some files changed. Here it says Webpack building, right? Because I changed some TypeScript. I'm running under Dotnet Watch, and so when I go over here, so there was no F5, there was no refresh the web page, right? This pushed the code out. That's called hot module reloading. And so now, clicking and counting by threes, right? So that's really slick, I think. So you don't have to use this. It's a nice feature that's available in Webpack, but it definitely is, it's a nice thing to use while you're developing. But I think it's also an example of, like, these are well thought out scaffolds that go through and do all this stuff as far as how it's, how everything's wired together. I want to go back and show one other neat thing in here as far as, okay. So this also has some stuff in here that handles things like in my startup, it has a catch-all route for the single page app. So again, this is something that's, that's nice to kind of handle that for me. So it's got this map, spa, fallback route, so that's kind of neat. And then if you do want to dig through the code for that, if you go out to JavaScript Services, so it's, do I have it open? So the code's all here. You'll see it's a very active repo. So like if we look at issues, there's a lot of them cranking in regularly. And if we look at commits, I've been subscribed to it and I'm seeing these come in like all the time, right? So it was just bumped to the latest version 8 or 9 days ago. And then there's newer things coming in after that. Let me see. I think that was about it for that. Does anyone have any questions on that? What's going on with that? So let me roll back a second to the slide I had where I kind of spelled out what the different options are. Just kind of remind you what we covered. Right. So that's kind of the general. See if I can remember. I think it's Shift F5. There it is. So your options as you start. File new project will get you set up with an app that will run on Windows, Mac, Linux, whatever. It handles all the kind of restoring. It uses Bower under the hood, and then it does bundling and minification. Visual Studio integrates with it, and it works with Task Runner Explorer. And it also has these command line, these CLI options that are added in. And that's all kind of handled for you. That's pulled in as a NuGet package and it's wired up, right? So then if you want, you right click on your bundle config and you say upgrade to Gulp file. And then we looked at Gulp and why you'd use Gulp and what Gulp does and the kind of general like tasks you can do. And I showed some of that, but then I kind of pointed out that after a while, this can be a good amount to configure. And it's not really necessary to write all that by hand unless you want to. So it can be better to start with something working and then tweak it, right? So we looked at Yeoman, and there's the general ASP.NET templates, and then we kind of finished up with this JavaScript Services templates. I'm really excited about these JavaScript Services templates. They just came out. There's a lot of new stuff happening with them. And they do all kinds of crazy things under the hood, like they actually are executing node modules, like so NPM packages, and they can execute arbitrary NPM packages. So inside, like on the server, you can say run this NPM package and it'll run it for you. So there's some crazy magic happening under the hood. That's it for me. Any questions? No? All right. Thank you.